We're needing to shed the mythology and cosmology of the past, and particularly the archetypes of the Age of Aries that permeated through the Age of Pisces, and we're now facing all the shadow aspects of that.
Moses comes down from the mount, right, with the plates of got the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, and he sees that they're worshiping the golden calf, which may have been a reference to Osiris and the Apis bull or something for them.
Part of my approach as an astrologer is evolutionary astrology, and I've been very influenced by Jeffrey Wolf Green's work. It shows you that these mysteries were there throughout the ages. They just got suppressed and forgotten.
Absolutely.
But they've been encoded in stone, then encoded in paintings, and you also talked about how they were encoded in Shakespeare's work. So
Yes.
it's like they were hidden, but still messages there for those who were able to see them or hear them.
Judgment is a source of suffering, but suffering becomes the source of enlightenment. Heather Ensworth, what a pleasure to have you on the Think Tank. You've got such an amazing background. You're truly an expert on precession of equinox. You're also a psychologist. You're an avid and an amazing astrologist as well. And you somehow integrate all of this into an approach that you have for wellness and well-being that I think is also amazing. And so it's such a pleasure to have you here on Think Tank.
No, thank you, Robert. It's great. It's an honor to be here and be in conversation with you. We have a lot of interest in common, so it's great to do this with you today.
We do. We definitely do. So tell us and our viewers about how you got into what you're doing. It sounds like you went down a more traditional path in the beginning and then somehow veered over into, the esoteric and mystical. And how did that transition happen?
That's a great question. So I always, even as a psychologist, was trying to integrate that with spirituality, but I was doing it in a more conventional context of being in a full-time practice, doing a lot of teaching, a lot of work, inpatient, outpatient. They're in California, actually, in the LA area. And I actually had a very profound kind of crisis moment where I had this very strong message from Spirit that basically the message that came through to me was, if you do not leave your life as you've known it, you will die.
Wow.
And I knew with every fiber of my being that was true. So, and I left a full-time successful practice, sold my home, moved across the country, didn't know what I was moving towards, just knew that I was being called to leave that old life behind. And that led me into exploring ancient wisdom and healing traditions. I got into shamanic practices, astrology, explored a lot of different paths, ended up studying a lot about prehistory. So it just led me into the direction that eventually came together in what I'm doing today.
Wow. So can I ask, what was the catalyst, I guess, around that crisis?
I think it was a combination of things. I didn't know, because I didn't know astrology till later. I was in some very powerful Pluto transits.
Okay.
Pluto is the planet of rebirth. So, and interestingly enough, as I was going through that transition, it was a period of years that I was in that process. And ironically, I was going through a series of Pluto transits on a number of the planets in my chart. And I remember at the time saying to people, I feel like every aspect of my life is going through a death, rebirth, relationships, house, career, family connections. It was all this process of transformation and transition.
And what year was this?
This was in 1993.
Wow. Interesting. And so were you, prior to that time, had you been, I guess, more of a traditional, but still integrating spirituality into your psychology practice? does that imply that you were a student of Carl Jung?
Very good. I was very interested in Jungian psychology. I actually, interestingly, I came out of a pretty conservative Christian background and was originally trying to integrate that. The program I went to, I actually got a master's in theology and a PhD in clinical psychology. But then during that time, and this was part of, I think, what led to the shift, I went through a real crisis, spiritual crisis, and realized that whole framework didn't fit me anymore. And that was part of what led to then a whole sequence of changes that ended up with my leaving and going on this very different path.
So was it mainly spiritually motivated?
You mean the
transition
crisis
that you went through? Yes, this crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That was the feeling that I had.
Because it was a sense that I'm on this path of success, this trajectory. I've kind of reached the goals that I had in building my practice and my psychological work. And I both felt like I'd reached the limitations of what traditional psychology can do in helping people heal. So that was part of the crisis. And then the spiritual crisis was the other aspect of it.
Wow.
And then I realized my whole identity, as I've kind of constructed it, doesn't fit anymore. And I need to get into a context where I can be in this liminal space and in the not knowing to see what new needs to emerge.
So how did you get introduced into the concepts of precession?
Hi, I'm Robert Edward Grant. I invite you to explore my transformative books, Philomath and Polymath, each designed to expand your understanding of the world and ourselves. In Philomath, which means lover of learning, discover how mathematics weaves together physics, music, and prime number theory, revealing the universe's interconnected nature. It's more than a book, it's an enlightening voyage. Polymath builds on Philomath's insights, exploring the genius of thinkers like Pythagoras and Da Vinci, who used geometry to revolutionize science, art, and governance. Rediscover the polymathic roots that sparked past ages of enlightenment. Join me on this journey as well. Visit robertedwardgrant.com to get your copies today. Let's foster a new era of enlightenment and collaboration for a brighter future.
That is a great question. I think I've always been interested, as I got into astrology, I was very interested in cosmology. I'm very interested in how mythology changes from one age to the next. And I think what led me into precession was my interest. So part of my path of spiritual exploration was exploring ancient sacred feminine wisdom that had gotten suppressed in this patriarchal period, which led me into a fascination with prehistory, which led to a realization that some of the information that we have, particularly from the Age of Taurus, where the sacred feminine was still honored, is so radically different from what we moved into in terms of our mythology and cosmology in the Age of Aries. So then I started to realize it's all connected to these shifting ages of precession, which led me into a deeper and deeper dive with that. And then I've been very interested in Bibhu Dev Misra's work on the Yuga cycle, how that interfaces with the precessional cycle. They're one and the same. So then I've been fascinated with that whole process of our human evolutionary cycle through ascending and descending consciousness.
Absolutely.
And part of what I'm excited to talk about today is how Orion is so key to all of that.
Well, it's so interesting that you segue us into that, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And I guess I look at Orion, I don't know if you agree with me on this, as really the true, whether you call it Orion or Osiris or any other names it goes by, and the meanings and symbology behind it, it's really the monomyth that then gets broken down into all these different cultural aspects that are just slight variations on a similar theme. And it comes down to a hero's journey. And I mean, even when we look at kind of like the Deacon of Astrology is really about 4 different mythological stories for the most part, right? It's the story of Orion and Artemis. It's also Osiris, which is obviously related to that as well. The story of Hercules and the 12 labors, the story of Jason and the Argonauts, and the story of Perseus and Andromeda. And those 4 stories, I believe, are somehow tied to the 4 North Stars that we transit through in our precessional period of 24,000 years. So right now we're Polaris, our North Pole is pointing to Polaris, but 6,000 years ago, it was pointing to a star that was called Thuban in the Dracos constellation. And 6,000 years before that, it was Vega in the Lyra constellation. And 6,000 years before that, it was Deneb in the Cygnus constellation. And somehow I believe these 4 mythologies, these 4 stories that are really just different variations on the same monomyth story, actually, because even the Epic of Gilgamesh has a lot of the 12 labors embedded within it, as well as the story of Orion. So Gilgamesh can be in some cases the story of Orion in some cases, and in other cases it could be the story of Hercules fighting the Hydra, for example. Gilgamesh is often associated with Orion, and the Hydra is a story of Enkidu fighting alongside Gilgamesh, but that's the story of Hercules.
I agree with everything you're saying, except part of what and Rob Comer and I talk a lot, and I really respect his work and what he's done with sort of unpacking with you some of the core stories and archetypes. But part of what fascinates me is that I love to trace certain archetypes and how the understanding of those archetypes shift dramatically as you move from one age to another. The archetype of Lilith, for example, is fascinating in that regard. But even Orion, who I see, so we have the 12 constellations of the zodiac that I think each, as you're saying, relate to different labors or different stories or different aspects of our journey as humanity. But I see Orion as symbolic of Osiris, and the whole Isis Osiris story is the story of Precession.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So Orion I see as that guide to us of this journey that we're in as humanity in our own ascending and descending cycle. And as you know, Orion moves in its declination in the sky from low on the horizon, where it was when you and I believe the Great Pyramid was built 12,000 years ago, to its highest point in the sky, where it is now. And there's some really interesting configurations happening now and across the next several years with the upraised arm of Orion, which for me is symbolic, coming from ancient Egypt, of order triumphs over chaos, resurrection. But even Orion, as we move into the age of Aries, becomes the hunter, becomes the conqueror, becomes the one who's slaying the wild animals. It takes on this age of Aries energy.
Yeah, got a flavor with each of the ages.
So, and it really morphs. So, for example, I believe that Orion is symbolic of that evolutionary journey. The constellation opposite Orion, Ophiuchus, I see, the healer, the serpent bearer holding the serpent, is such a symbol of the integration of the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine. The serpent is the oldest known image of the great goddess. Ophiuchus is basically our consciousness in its wholeness.
Yeah.
And how amazing that Ophiuchus, the constellation, is just above Scorpius. the constellation that has to do with trauma, transformation, death. And Ophiuchus's, this is the resurrection. This is moving into wholeness. But even the archetype of the serpent in ancient times was seen as the great goddess. You move into the Age of Aries, you have the story of the Garden of Eden. It becomes a symbol of evil, deceit, and it becomes demonized. So I think that as we move, this is part of what I'm really fascinated with. As we move particularly into the Age of Taurus, and it's towards the end of the Age of Taurus into Age of Aries that we really move into the Kali Yuga, the time of our lower level of consciousness when we forget what we once knew. To me, it's that part of the precessional cycle where we get out of balance, out of harmony, get caught in the paradigm of separation, power over, and then we have these stories and myths that aren't the myths of the past, that we're all about living in right relationship, right harmony, right love with all that is, Ma'at, the principle of the harmony of the spheres. So I think our stories change. I think the myths change dramatically, and we lose the connection that in the Kali Yuga, the sacred feminine gets suppressed, and we get caught in disconnection from nature, from the wisdom of the cosmos. We get caught in these paradigms of conquer or be conquered, power over, survival of the fittest. So I think so many of our stories, and one of the things I'm fascinated with and passionate about is I think as astrology moves into the Aquarian age, we are going to need to rename and reframe our understanding of the planets such that a planet like Mars is no longer named after the god of war, the Roman god of war. What if Mars became Horus, or a more modern archetype, Frodo? The meaning for Frodo out of the Tolkien novel, someone in my community told me the old English meaning of that word is the one who's come to wisdom through experience. So I feel like our astrology is really going to change as we move into the Aquarian age, and we're needing to shed the mythology and cosmology of the past, and particularly the archetypes of the Age of Aries that permeated through the Age of Pisces, and we're now facing all the shadow aspects of that as we're in this profound transition time out of the Kali Yuga into the time of the ascending cycle of consciousness.
You know, it's interesting. I often say that we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are, because we cannot separate the outer world from our conditioning biases, whatever they may be. And the collective conditioning bias is the zodiac. So the lens that we see everything through is going to be painted in part by the collective conditioning bias of whatever that age is basically, pointing towards. So if we're looking at, and it's also true for its shadow imagery. So you talked about Ophiuchus and Orion. And I, about a year and a half ago in late 2023, in November 23, I posited and put out a post, and I said, I believe that the 13th and 14th constellations for the zodiac are actually Ophiuchus and Orion, that Orion himself is the missing 1/14th. And that this from the story, it's a reference, of course, from the story of Osiris when his brother kills him and cuts him into 14 parts. And the 1/14th part that was missing turns out to be the phallus. And what's interesting about all of this, though, is that as I noticed in my work of precession, which was I was really just starting to find the patterns. And I've started now come to the realization that spiritual awakening is a form of apophenia, right? So apophenia is when you have like pattern recognition and you're able to see patterns. Or if you don't have the ability to see patterns, you have something called hypoapophenia. And this means that you have a low ability to see patterns and perceive patterns, and also that maybe it impedes your creativity and your imagination, right?
Because it's all right brain pattern.
It's all right brain, exactly. So people with apophenia happen to have large caudate, right? So the caudate, which is the part of the brain's anatomy that's kind of right before you get into the frontal cortex. So it's kind of a little bit back. And the enlarged caudate basically shows up in people that have a high pattern recognition. And I believe that this is actually what we start to experience physiologically when we go through a spiritual awakening. That we're starting to be able to perceive patterns that maybe before we were dimensionally limited from. And maybe we're the ones who chose to be dimensionally limited from it.
Well, that's a very interesting philosophical question in and of itself. But what's also interesting, because I used to be in neuropsychology for a while, is that, in the age of Aries, prehistory, up to through the age of Taurus, we were more right brain dominant. Age of Aries, we became more left brain dominant. Now, as we're moving into the age of Aquarius, they're actually finding that the corpus callosum, bridging the hemispheres, is getting larger, and we're more coming back into balance with left brain, right brain ways of knowing. So again, at that neurological level, we're coming back into wholeness.
Yeah, it's hemisynchronization of the two lobes of the brain. And that also tells you that we're going to be in balance between masculine and feminine during this age. It's not, like if you could go back and see where there was a matriarchal order or a patriarchal order that had been established, it's going to be tied directly to the dominance of the brain hemisphere of that age. Except
that what they find, for example, in the age of Taurus, which we know the sacred feminine energy was really valued and seen as, the myth of Inanna coming out of ancient Sumer, Venus is the primary deity, but it wasn't matriarchal. It wasn't a flip of the power over paradigm. It was matrilineal, but very communal. So we only get caught in that power over dynamic in the patriarchal period, in the Kali Yuga.
Yeah. Yes. So, but what I started noticing as well, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, that I was seeing archetypes across society and history that basically showed that, you think about the age of Taurus, which would have been about 4000 BC, right? So age of Taurus, and during that time, you have kind of like learning, which is a very Taurian thing, right? You started to see the early stages of civilization during that period of our civilization. I think actually gets wiped every 6,000 years, but that's another topic we'll go into in just a moment. But basically the opposite of the sign of Taurus is Scorpio. So then we have reference also to the rise of the pharaohs in dynastic Egypt, which is, the Scorpion king. And then we go from Taurus into the time of, say, Moses, right? And during that time, it's no longer, about the golden calf. Moses comes down from the mount, right, with the plates of, got the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, and he sees that they're worshiping the golden calf, which may have been a reference to Osiris and the Apis bull or something for them.
I think it's actually a reference to the age of Taurus, where
that's what I mean.
And then you move into the age of Aries, and the ram becomes sacred.
Right. So then all of a sudden Moses says, no more worshiping the idolatry of the cow or the bull of Taurus, because we've moved now into a different age. Now we'll put lamb's blood on your door to make sure that you survive the Passover. Right. And so then all the prophecies of, even by Isaiah, right, of Jesus about 600 years, 700 years BC, all the prophecies were about the lion and the lamb, right, laying down together. The Son of Man could be the Lamb of God, were the references to the messianic prophecy. But when Jesus comes, he's like, no, it's not about lambs. It's about, I'm going to make you fishermen of men.
Exactly. Age of Pisces.
Age of Pisces. And then the backdrop, the shadow aspect of this is the age of Virgo, which is why we start to venerate virginity in society, and why the Virgin Mary became such a powerful archetype for, the age of Pisces as a backdrop. So we have these kind of like shadow aspects, and there's a persona aspect and there's a shadow aspect. The persona collectively of the conditioning bias of the persona becomes whatever your, sun sign is, right, in that, and where we're passing through the precession of equinox, and that dominates. So now we're now into the age of Aquarius. Our opposite sign is what? The opposite sign is Leo. So you can bet that probably gold prices will go up because
well, they are.
They are, right? So this is all part of the wave frequency of the backdrop of the collective shadow and the collective persona.
Brilliantly said. And the thing that I'm fascinated with, because part of my approach as an astrologer is evolutionary astrology. And I've been very influenced by Jeffrey Wolf Green's work. Mm-hmm. And part of what he talked about a lot is how those signs manifest depend on our level of consciousness, mm-hmm. and whether we're accessing the true archetypal meaning or we're getting caught in the shadow aspect of that. So part of what you're saying that I think is so important is he also talked about how every age begins with the energy of that age, like the age of Taurus begins with this energy of Taurus, the sacred calf, the sacred bull. Then the sub-age, the second half of that age, is dominated by the sign opposite, Scorpio. And it's interesting. So every age then has its sub-age, meaning we're meant to bring those polarities into wholeness. But how we work with them will depend on our level of consciousness. So, for example, Christ in his teachings was trying to move out of the age of Aries, of power over, back into that mystical awareness of the oneness of all that is, and the reweaving of the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine. But the age of Aries, permeated into the age of Pisces. So we took those mystical teachings of Buddha, of Christ, we end up turning them into organized, institutionalized religions that then are all into power. And then the sub-age of Virgo becomes, how do we idealize our analytical minds? And we get all caught up in our left brain ways of being and analyzing things. Whereas if we'd worked that at a higher consciousness, we would have embraced the lesson of Pisces to move back into mystical, spiritual awareness and oneness, to then Virgo manifest that in our daily lives to be of service to others, Virgo. So each age has its gift and its shadow aspect, but how we as humanity respond to that depends on how it will manifest.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it makes you wonder, the question is like, was this something that we just chose to experience? When I say we, I mean collectively, right? And that the one divides itself into the many so that it can experience itself through our unique eyes of perception with the different backdrops that provide this collective conditioning bias.
Exactly. So why would we go through ascending, descending consciousness? Is it to go through the time of the Kali Yuga, the time of forgetting, the time of separation, to at the end of that time return back to that awareness of oneness, of who we really are, with a greater appreciation, a greater maturity, a greater depth? But I think the crisis point for us now as humanity is, will we realize this is now the time of remembrance and return? Or will we stay caught in that paradigm of separation and power over, in which case the age of Aquarius can manifest as the extremes of technology and transhumanism and disconnection from the deeper meaning of Aquarius, which is the water bearer pouring the living waters of wisdom to the earth to help us remember and come back into balance.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, you just think about this. I've been thinking about this a lot in the last few days, in fact. So it's interesting you say that if I were going to write the script of my multi-faceted, multi-dimensional life, I would probably, to make it interesting, and knowing myself that I love cryptography, I like to solve puzzles, right? I would probably say, okay, what's the great underlying theme? Well, it all comes down to knowing, just like every hero's journey, it's not what the hero accomplishes in the outer world that becomes the central thesis of the story. It's what he learns about himself, or she learns about herself in the inner world, that becomes the central thesis. It's the incremental self-love and the realization that the only thing that had held them back before was their own perception of themselves. And this is why we love flawed characters. We love to have some sort of like often out of place flaw that someone would have. Like, for example, for Orion, he's got this boastful quality, right? And so that's based on the backdrop of the perception of what age we're in.
But that's in Greek mythology.
That's in Greek mythology, yes.
I really think the original myth of Orion as Osiris was the enlightened one. And then we get to the Greek mythology of Orion, and he is all about ego, and he's boastful, and he is really trying to be in that power over dynamic. But Osiris was so aligned with Isis in being in that balance of sacred masculine, sacred feminine, and I believe mortality, immortality, to be here in form in an enlightened way. And then Set, who's the beginning of that power over competition dynamic, tries to kill him and assert his power and take over his leadership. And I think that struggle of Osiris and Set is the struggle of humanity. Do we choose to be living out of that higher consciousness and harmony with all that is Osiris, or get caught in chaos?
Well, yes. And Osiris comes across as, even in the Egyptian mythology, comes across as everything just goes right for him in general, up until that moment when he's like, oh, this is a coffin that I could have if I fit in it. I mean, which is kind of like slapstick humor almost. And but the story of Osiris, we have to also be fair to Set to figure out, okay, why was Set so angry? Well, because, he had an affair with Set's wife, Nephthys, right? And they ended up having a child together, Anubis, and that didn't make Set very happy, right? So he's got, again, there's a jealousy there. And, both Nephthys and her sister Isis love Osiris. So everybody loves Osiris. And nobody loves Set, right? Nobody's got the love for Set. So Set, in his own way, in his own thinking, felt like, okay, he was justified in doing this because he had been done wrong by his brother. And also that comes across like, okay, so why is it okay to have Osiris have, two women at the same time, type of thing, especially women like those women who are sisters? And it's because, there is an aspect of it. So you could see where the Greeks would have said, okay, well, he's kind of boastful because he's got these two women after him. It's an interesting way to look at it when you start looking at it through the lens of the actual age that it would have been created in.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably what happened in Greece, right? Because they would have looked at him at an age time frame that would have been, more in the age of Aries than in the age of Taurus.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's exactly right. And part of, what I feel sad about is we don't have more ancient myths. The earliest myths we have come from around 3000 BCE in the age of Taurus. So we rely on for that, because you and I think, are both in agreement that there are these incredibly advanced ancient cultures. The culture that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx 12,000 years ago. But we don't have any written myths from that time. And I think then it is the messages in stone that we have. And I do believe that those who built the pyramids of the Giza Plateau were leaving us messages in stone because they weren't giving us written records. You and I both think they may be buried under the Giza Plateau. But they left us this profound message in the monuments there that is connected to the earth energies and sky energies that's telling a whole story. And I do believe the Giza Plateau is telling the story of this evolutionary journey that we're in as humanity through that precessional cycle and trying to remind us to remember who we are, that we're in this journey. And as you said, as we go through each age, we go through the cosmology that comes through the lens of that time, that age, that sign, that constellation in the zodiac. But part of the book that I'm working on now, called The Processional Key, is that like the ancient medicine wheel, at some point we need to wake up as humanity and realize, oh, we go through these 12 energies and lenses and cosmologies, but we can eventually come to center and align with the energies of the earth and sky, move into higher dimensional consciousness, and know that we can partake of any of those energies, but we're no longer bound by them and mired in that perspective for that part of the cycle. Then we no longer have to go through that ascending and descending cycle. We can stay in higher consciousness.
So, it's coming to me right now, just as I'm listening to what you're saying, that the awakening really is a shift in collective perspective.
Yes.
And that shift in perspective changes literally everything, because the lens through which we see everything, it's like we've gone from one lens that was like a particular color, and now we're going to an entirely different lens that shows up. Maybe it's got the zoom feature on it better than the past lens. We can actually get into understanding things better. Maybe as we move towards the Satya Yuga in the cycle, Satya just means truth. This is the lens through which we see the world, and we know it from the true perspective that it actually is. And that's what we would then say and reference as a higher consciousness. So we're going through this collective lens shift. Now, you mentioned the Great Pyramid. Tell me about your experience in the Great Pyramid, and what you have learned about that, and this leaving a record in stone that you reference.
Yes, I want to dive into that. But just before I do that, like you said, I think as we go through that cycle with the zodiac, it fascinates me in correlating the Hindu Yuga cycle with the precessional cycle. That we start into the Kali Yuga and into that time of lower consciousness as we move into the Age of Taurus. All the fixed signs mark shifts in the Yuga cycle.
Yeah.
But we move into the Golden Age in the Age of Scorpio, which is interesting. But if you realize that the constellation Ophiuchus is above Scorpius, it's actually the Age of Ophiuchus.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Orion, the constellation Orion, was the heliacal constellation rising before the sun at spring equinox here in the northern hemisphere, as we're shifting out of the age of Gemini into the age of Taurus. So Orion really speaks to that journey of descent and return. Ophiuchus is the constellation that represents this is who we are when we're fully awakened and in our wholeness.
So it's interesting. So then maybe as you sort of point that out, it's making me think about Pisces, Age of Pisces. It's making me think about the Age of Gemini. It's making me think about, or rather, the age. I guess it's going to be backwards. So, no, it would have been Gemini. That's right. So Pisces, Gemini, and then all the ones that are immediately preceding the fixed signs. Right?
Yeah.
So I guess that would be Virgo, rather. It would be Virgo, not Gemini. So it'd be Virgo, Pisces, and then what are the other fixed signs? It's so you got Aquarius, so that's going to be.
We're talking about the mutable signs of Sagittarius.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Sagittarius, Gemini, Virgo, Pisces.
Yes, that's right. So those are going to be ages at the end of those ages where there's going to be literally like a massive sea change in perception going into the next cycle of the next fixed sign. And maybe that is what's related also to the shift of the North Pole, to which star we're basically pointing to.
Well, and as you said, I'd love to circle back to what you said earlier, that there are these crisis points every 6,000 years, and particularly at the beginning and ending of a precessional cycle, where we are now, coming out of the age of Pisces. You're right. These are crucial change points. And then, 12,000 years ago, we had the Younger Dryas crisis. We had probably a pole shift. And we're in process with one now. But then at the 6,000 year point, we also had major cataclysmic changes on the planet. So we go through these times that are marked by these crucial shifts in the precessional cycle. And I think that crisis 6,000 years ago is part of what led us into the Kali Yuga, that led us into fear, a trauma response, that led then into trauma coping mechanisms, which are about fight, flight, freeze, and how that's played out in the traumatization of our human culture. But I think the Great Pyramid was built after that cataclysmic crisis 12,000 years ago as an effort to remind us, remember this cycle, remember the phases of the cycle, and know that you're being held and protected and guided through it. I mean, you and I both talk a lot about how the pyramids are oriented to the belts of Orion.
Yeah.
And there's so much, and what you've done in the King's Chamber is incredibly significant in terms of it's mirroring the precessional cycle. I think it's amazing that the sarcophagus is on the wall where Leo is. You go through this death rebirth in the ceremony in the sarcophagus and come out facing the opposite wall with Aquarius. I mean, there's so many ways in which, and the Giza Plateau, I don't know if you know Scott Creighton's work, but building on Beauval's work, Robert Beauval. And you've explored the Queen's pyramids. I haven't had a chance to do that yet, but he looked at their configurations in relationship with the three main pyramids and said the alignments and the geometry of that is all showing the degrees of Orion when it's at its lowest declination and then its highest. So the Giza Plateau is saying you're in the cycle, 12,000 year cycle of ascending, descending consciousness. And remember that you're just part of that process. But then it's got those star shaft alignments to Sirius, our binary star, guiding us through that cycle. And by the way, your work with the speed of that and how the precessional cycle relates to that being a part of a binary star cycle, and how you showed how it speeds up and slows down depending on where we are in that process, such that the precessional cycle is 24,000 years long, I think is critical. That's what enables us to then integrate the precessional cycle with the Hindu Yuga cycle, which is 24,000 years. Yeah. I think that was a really key piece of work you did.
No, thank you.
But the Giza Plateau is just showing in so many ways that this is the process and cycle that we go through.
Well, it forms a triangle. So the triangle is the same one from Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. If you take the square, and most people think he was trying to square the circle, but he was a good enough mathematician to know that the square he made was too small to be the same area as the circle. And they have an adjacent, base. So they're basically tangent, the circle and square are tangent at their base. But what's interesting about this is if you take that, because that then could be an encryption for a hidden triangle. And the hidden triangle then is you take the base of the square, connect it to the top of the circle. And that creates a triangle that's the same as the one that's a pyramid on the back of the dollar bill, which is 67.38 degree angle. And that creates a 5, 12, 13 proportion, which 5, 12, 13, double that, you have 10, 24, and 26. And that forms the triangle that's exactly the relationship of the precession of equinox.
Well,
so you got a 24,000 year cycle and a 26,000 year cycle, and then it goes down to a 22,000 year cycle when you take the logarithm, right, of the same thing and make a right angle on the side of it. And that means that half of the precession, and this is also matching what we call total mass energy versus rest mass energy and velocity. As we increase our gravity, time speeds up. And our gravitational pull of Sirius A will then cause us to basically experience time going by faster. Like time flies when we're having fun.
Well, and I also wonder, I don't know if you would have the same perception, but it seems to me that when we're in that faster part of the cycle, we're in the part of our binary orbit with Sirius where we're moving closer to Sirius A.
Yeah.
That's when our consciousness increases.
Yes.
And as we move further away, then we go into that time of forgetting, and we're in the time where time slows down, but we're now in the part of the cycle where we're moving back into that remembrance and back into that higher level of consciousness.
It must be like, therefore, if the sun relates to our persona and ego, then Sirius A being farther away from us in the cycle would represent a greater separation between our subconscious mind and our conscious mind. And as we proceed closer and closer back to Sirius, then Sirius becomes a connection that we have to our subconscious. And as those two become very close together, then it's like a superconscious relationship.
Yeah.
And that's the stages of awakening and towards enlightenment that we experience in the cycle.
Yes. And I think it is absolutely fascinating that now we're in this time where we're shifting into ascending consciousness at summer solstice here in the northern hemisphere, winter solstice in the southern hemisphere. The sun is literally right at the upraised arm of Orion in the sky. Order out of chaos, coming back into higher consciousness. And I think this time that we're in now, 2020, 25 to 2032, is the critical choice point for us as humanity. Are we going to move into higher consciousness or cling to the paradigms of the past and the paradigms of forgetting and separation? And I find it absolutely amazing that in 2032, June 28th, when Saturn and Uranus come back into conjunction with each other, which is symbolic of new forms, starting new ways of being, they're conjunct in the upraised arm of Orion.
Mm-hmm.
44 years ago, when they were in conjunction last, they were in alignment with the galactic center.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, the wisdom of the sky is trying to guide us through this transition. And I feel like the message then was, bring yourselves back into connection with Source. Come back into spiritual awareness. And then now, 44, 45 years later, 2032, now you can move into new forms that are reflective of that movement into higher consciousness, order over chaos, resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. All right, so let's go back to the pyramid. So tell me about your research in the Great Pyramid. Have you actually been to the pyramid?
Oh, yes. I lead trips there often. And
Mm-hmm.
have been
Oh,
there.
you do lead trip there. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Wow.
And as you know, I mean, it's life-changing to be in the King's Chamber, to
Absolutely.
have a private ceremony there. I know you've spent all night there.
Many
I've
times.
just
Yeah.
I've just done the 2-hour private
Mhm.
ceremony times.
Mhm.
But, to guide a group there and have them go through ceremony, to go each have a chance to be in the sarcophagus, to go through, I really believe the Great Pyramid was guiding us into that ceremonial process of death, rebirth, to come out of that experience remembering who we truly are, spiritual beings having this human experience and back in alignment with our soul selves. And as you've said, I think it's also a stargate. It's
Yeah.
so connecting the earth to the stars and to the cosmos, again, reminding us that we're a part of this interconnected oneness of all that is.
It's beautiful. So the first time you heard about what I'd been positing and saying, first discovery was on the sarcophagus, the Alpha and Omega on the back rim.
Yes, which I found the last trip.
You
After
found
watching
it.
you again, I found it.
Oh, good, good. What did that feel like?
Amazing. It's incredible, but I never would have seen it if I hadn't.
It's hard to see, isn't it? It's really
Yeah.
hard.
But
It is
once you know
really.
it's there, you can see it.
Mm-hmm. You have to put light kind of indirectly on it, and then you'll be able to see it. But the reason why I found it was because I remembered being there when it was put there.
Wow. Wow.
And that's how I saw it. Like literally, I was in a different time dimension with different people in the room, and I saw this blue-green light going on top of it. And then all of a sudden, Alpha Omega getting pressed into its rim. And right where I remembered it being, I came back into this time dimension. I looked at the exact spot, and there it was. And because I would have never seen it otherwise. It's not easy to find. It's even when you know where it is, it's not easy to find. But then the next thing we discovered was the bull on the north wall. Have you been able to find that too?
Oh, I worked so hard at it this last trip.
Uh-huh.
I can kind of feel the energetics, but could not see it.
Yeah. So I'm going to show you, if you want, exactly so you can see it. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And I think that's kind of one of the beautiful aspects of this. I'll show first this. Let me go ahead and share this with you. So this is the rim of the sarcophagus right here. You can see the alpha. There's actually a chi there as well.
Yep.
Alpha chi omega. This peak is at the 33rd inch, and
wow, that's
along the sarcophagus. And this is at the 30th inch right here, right? Which is 0.33, 30 inches is 0.33, the length of the sarcophagus, because it's 89.62 inches, the total sarcophagus length. So, this is basically, find a better image for you here. This is the bull on the north wall. You can see the point of the horn here and here, and you can see it come down, and it's right in the center of the north wall. So the next time you're in the King's Chamber, you'll look here and you'll be able to see this. You can see a diamond shape right here.
Yep.
Okay, and it's a straight line right here and right here, which it shouldn't have, right? And then another one descending right here, and another one here descending. It's making this shape, like two diamonds merging into each other. There's writing on top of it too. Looks like there's writing on top of this diamond shape.
I see where you mean. Yes.
See what I mean? I don't know what the writing is, but there's something. Right? So can you see that?
Yes.
So basically, if we go now, I'll find we'll go and find the actual video footage of this as well. Then you'll be able to find it easily when you go inside the Great Pyramid. Again, because you'll be back there again probably pretty soon, I'm guessing.
Next March.
Next March, okay. This was actually discovered by my then wife. Okay. Now you could see it from the side here, and you could see that it's actually raised and it's etched into the wall.
Well, when you use light like that, it's much easier to see the gradations.
You see that?
Yeah, absolutely.
You see the bull horns right here, and there's a cow next to it, outside of it, that's larger with an eye right there.
Yep.
So that's the Hathor. So just look at that one more time. This is the cow right here. So it's the small, like baby bull and the cow, the mother. And this is the snout of the cow.
Well, and
Mm-hmm.
you probably know Bernadette Brady, the astrologer in particular, associates Horus with Taurus. So isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because as Orion is disappearing from view at spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, it's Taurus rising in the sky.
Yep.
So the son of Osiris. So that's interesting.
Yep. So you see the bull horns right here, the face of the bull. Here's one of its eyes. Here's the other eye. And then its legs come down here, and its two front legs. And then it's got this diamond merging into another diamond, which represents also the shape of the Orion constellation, which looks like two, triangular diamonds merging into each other. And then this is the Hathor. So here's the eye of the mother cow. Here's the snout. Here's the neck. Here's the leg, and the hoofs come down, and then the two horns right here. So it's the Hathor and the story. And you'll see this also. Here's another view from the side.
Yes. So it's really encoding Horus is born into the house of Hathor and is arising as Orion is sinking and going through death, rebirth.
Correct. So, and here's Susie. Doing the same thing. Go ahead. Well, we just found something else here in the King's Chamber.
Wow.
And then we didn't see it at that time, but there's the larger cow around it.
Yep, I see that. I really see that.
So now you've seen, and you will probably remember, so the entrance would be right to the right of what we're looking at.
Which, Robert, isn't it interesting that where the entrance is, and this is why I was so fascinated with that diagram that you did where you showed where all the constellations are around the King's Chamber, because the door you enter in is Aries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first, right?
Which is the time of the lowest level of Kali Yuga, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's that you enter in that time of forgetting and darkness. You go through this ceremony of death, rebirth, to come back into higher consciousness.
Absolutely. That's exactly how I see it as well. So, well, now you've seen the bull and the cow. All the etchings look similar to that, right? And so this is where it gets really quite fascinating, because then it starts, once you see more gets revealed. And I don't know if you've seen the work that I did related to the Last Supper.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? The Last Supper painting, and noticing that in the exact same places where things were placed in the Last Supper are etch points in the wall.
Yes.
Right?
It shows you that these mysteries were there throughout the ages. They just got suppressed and forgotten.
Absolutely.
But they've been encoded in stone, then encoded in paintings. And you also talked about how they were encoded in Shakespeare's work. So yes. It's like they were hidden, mm-hmm. but still messages there for those who were able to see them or hear them.
Now, what's interesting is that when we took this photograph, we hadn't even yet discovered this bull thing on the wall, right? But now as we look at the photograph from the old photograph that we never saw anything there before, you could see the outline of the bull right on the right side.
Yes.
You see what I mean?
Yes.
And the larger cow that's around it. You could also see the eye. If it's here, it's not as clear in this photograph, but right in the same place.
It's really highlighting the 4 fixed
in the exact
signs
same place
for royal stars also.
Right in the exact same place on the Last Supper painting, you could see a cow hidden in the tapestry with a ridge of its back right here, and it has an AQW, which is Alpha Chi Omega. And there's a cow that's here, and inside of that, there's a bull. I have a better close-up of it, too, in higher res. You can see, but it's hidden in the exact same spot that it is on the wall. And by the same token, you look at the eye of a cat that is above Jesus' head in the Last Supper, and you can see like a cat, pupil that's kind of a slit-shaped pupil. In the exact same place is where we then expect to find, matching the ceiling points together, which is right here in this line right here, right? In the exact same place is literally the eye of Ra that was hidden, and you can see it's been scrubbed off somehow.
Yes, I remember you saying that. And you've actually counseled the Egyptians not to use chemicals on the walls anymore.
Yes, I have. And I mean, you could see again here, it's this shape that covers several blocks, right? It starts on this one at the crease point of these 2 blocks. And so all of the things that's when I realized, wait a minute, we can possibly use the Last Supper painting as a way to determine what to look for and where to look for it.
Exactly. It's amazing.
You see that?
Yes.
So all of this stuff is starting to kind of reveal itself. And so when you first heard about this, and then, Rob's works, I had told Rob, he said, well, what do you think's on the walls? And I said, well, I see a woman riding a horse, like a Pegasus or something, shooting a bow and arrow at an eagle. And he was like, well, that's pretty funny. I said, what do you mean? He said, you do realize that those are all constellations that are adjacent to each other in the deacon.
The deacons.
And the
work
deacons.
that you two did together is brilliant, and you and Rob have really put together something amazing in terms of rediscovering that. But here's the dilemma that I would love I call your team the mathemagicians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I think there's some hidden messages with the star shafts that we haven't fully tapped into yet.
So yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What do you think is the message?
Well, so the stars that are attributed to being in alignment with those shafts in the King's Chamber, the southern shaft is Sirius. Now, Sirius doesn't move with precession the way the other stars do, so that could be consistent. The northern shaft, they were tracking it by about 2450 BCE when the pyramid was supposedly built.
Sirius doesn't move with the other. I'm like literally now thinking about that, because it's like, it makes sense, but the implication of that is going to be substantive when you think about Shiva and Shakti and the distance between the two. So when Orion is far away from Sirius, right, he's not connected to his divine feminine.
Oh, yes.
Because Sirius is related to Shakti. That's the symbology of Isis.
I never thought of it that way before, but absolutely. Wow. Yeah. But it doesn't, probably because it is our binary star, it doesn't really move with precession the way the others do, 1 degree every 72 years. But the other shaft, they attribute it to being aligned with Thuban, which was the pole star 3000. But Mark Vidler thinks that it actually aligns with whatever the pole star is in that time frame. So he believes it's now aligned with Polaris, which would make sense. So the King's Chamber star shafts are really speaking to that precessional cycle and targeting Sirius, our binary star, And
He
the
thinks, wait, let me make sure I heard that right. He thinks that the shaft, the air shaft, which is not really an air shaft because it's not connected to the outer, but he thinks that it's aligning. It's like hands on a clock almost, where it's
yes,
pointing towards Polaris right now.
yes.
Fascinating.
So it would, well, he didn't actually say that, but I think that because he does believe that northern shaft is tracking whatever the pole star is given whatever age we're in. So then it would be exactly what you said, the precessional clock. But then the shafts in the Queen's Chamber, the eastern shaft, and again, this is around 2500 BCE, they attribute to being aligned to that belt star of Orion, the easternmost star, which is the star that the Great Pyramid is associated with. And then the other western shaft aligned to Beta Ursa Minor, which is a star in Ursa Minor that's part of the Dipper, of the Little Dipper.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking, why would it align with that star? So then I'm trying to see, would those shafts, this is what I can't figure out. Obviously, different stars are going to align to those shafts as we move through precession. I would love to know what were the stars, if there were stars, they were aligned with when it was built around 10,500 BCE.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps this is what I'm trying to explore in my own research. What if these ancient builders who were so advanced in their understanding and clearly knew about the precessional cycle, knew that it's about 4,000, 3,000 BCE that we move into the time of forgetting? What if they purposefully aligned those shafts to that time when we would go into the Kali Yuga? And one is aligned with Orion's belt, saying, remember, you're in this journey. The other one is aligned with that star in Ursa Minor, which in ancient times, that constellation was united with Draco. So it was the winged serpent. And that star is in the part of that combined constellation that would be the wings of the dragon or the serpent. And then I'm thinking, what in ancient Egypt relates to the winged serpent? Well, it's the goddess Wadjet, the cobra goddess with the wings, that is all about our movement into Kundalini rising, enlightenment. The Uraeus that they would have, the pharaoh would have coming out of, the third eye.
Mm-hmm.
So then I'm wondering, did they purposefully align those star shafts to be at that threshold of our going into our forgetting, to say, remember, you're Orion, you're in this journey of ascending, descending consciousness, but Wadjet, the protector goddess, is watching over you to help you come back again into higher consciousness, regain your wings, remember who you are. You're held and loved and supported in this journey into the underworld.
That's something really profound. And I think also I'm feeling like it's also meant to tell us where we are right now, whoever you are at whatever point in the equinox you're in.
But that's what I'd love if you could figure out. What do those shafts align with when it was built? What do they align with now? That would be fascinating, because they would be different stars because of the movement with precession. But I can't figure that out. I mean, the ones from the King's Chamber we can sort out. Sirius and whatever the pole star is at that current time.
Yep.
But I have no way of figuring out what the shifts would be with those other two shafts.
It's almost like I keep getting this vision right now that there's kind of a clue, I guess, which is if I were going to make a watch, right? So I have my watch here, and here the hands on my watch move, right? But on a watch that's going to be on Earth, you don't need to have the hands moving. You simply, because the Earth is moving. And with the Earth moving and we're cycling through, you'd have to have some stationary positions, something like air shafts, to be the hands that would then allow you to see where it's pointing, where you are in the cycle. They would have to be stationary, right? Because everything else is moving. It's like the face is moving and the hands stay in the exact same place, right? That's be two ways to show the clock. And if I were going to build it on a Giza plateau, of course, with no moving parts, I'm going to have it be the latter, right? Which is that there's a fixed orientation, but the earth is moving, and that's going to show my knowledge of how the earth moves and how it precesses through the equinox.
Which totally makes sense with those two shafts in the king's chamber. I'm just baffled by what's the meaning in that clock of the two in the queen's chamber.
Yeah, I don't know, but now it's got me really thinking. So that's part of this too. It's like, maybe the one divides itself into the many so that it can experience itself. I was telling that story. It's like, okay, if I'm going to build my life plan as my journey of life, I would probably say, okay, I'm going to be more consciously aware. It's likely to be about relationships because that transcends everything else, because all relationships are reflections of how I feel about myself, right? The people that love me in the outer world love me as I love myself.
Mm.
I'm only capable of loving others to the extent that I'm capable of loving myself, right? Otherwise, I'll just self-sabotage. And that's what happens all the time. So you could say that we start off life and then we go to this point where hopefully we experience some divine love experience. And along the way, your different relationships, whether they be romantic partnerships or whether they be just great friendships, should be reflective of your own degree of self-love in your wholeness and authenticity.
Mm.
If you only love yourself partially, that is a narcissistic path, right? Because narcissism is not true self-love. It's self-loathing for all the things that you don't want to see in yourself, and then you project it on everyone else around you.
Yeah, that was one of my specialties in psychology. Did 4 years of training in narcissistic and borderline personality disorders. You're exactly right. It comes from a sense of inner emptiness and insecurity.
Yeah. It's self-loathing. It's true self-loathing. So I wonder, it's like, okay, is the reason why, we experience these moments of separation, these moments of difficulty, is because it makes, when we come back together again, that much better. And then we remember how special it is to be in unity. And so the universe itself becomes this inhalation, exhalation process over and over again of falling out of love with itself and then falling back into love with itself over and over and over again. And it's like, if you're in the act of making love, right, with yourself in this way, and you had no motion whatsoever, you'd just be inside. It's like, okay, this is no fun, right? It needs to have the friction of going in and out, back and forth, in love, out of love, in love, out of love, separation, unity and separation. And I think that there's something to this.
What's amazing about what you're saying, Robert? Do you know Keone Hanalei?
I've heard of Keone, but I don't know them.
Well, he's an amazing wisdom keeper because he traces back his lineage at least 18,000 years.
Wow.
And he and I just had a conversation where he said his memory through his lineage is that in the ancient time of Lemuria, which dated back to, was part of the Golden Age period, he said it was all about being these basically beings of light forever in that experience of love. And then he talked about how they went into this time of really developing the meaning of love, which led into kind of that sense of observing it, conceiving it, that led us into this journey then of separating from love, experiencing that loss. And now we're in this time where we're meant to remember that. And it's exactly what you're saying, to come back into self-love, which then opens us to true love with others, not transactional relationships or power over relationships, but true relationships from the heart. And then we remember that meaning of oneness. So maybe it is that we go through these ascending and descending cycles to experience separation, to come back into such a deeper appreciation and understanding of that meaning of love and of unity consciousness, not as oneness in the sense of sameness, but the incredible embracing of diversity, Aquarian age, of everyone is a fractal expression of cosmic consciousness in all our uniqueness, but we're all part of the oneness. But would we know that if we hadn't experienced the experience of separation?
Probably not. Right? It's like, how do you know what pleasure is unless you've experienced pain?
Yeah.
Right? And we learn here through opposites, I believe. And whatever we're here to learn, we can know simply by asking ourselves, what's the experience I keep experiencing that I keep resisting?
Yeah.
So if I'm experiencing a period of my life of continually not receiving love or being in relationships that feel empty or one-sided, right? Then the way we solve this is by leaning into the thing that we fear.
Yes, exactly. Doing that inner work.
And accepting it, learning to have acceptance. If you're really triggered by betrayal as a concept, and you say to yourself, I would never leave a man down, or I would never leave somebody in a lurch, and you get triggered whenever you hear of it or you see somebody else do it, then that's a trigger for you to then integrate and learn, which is maybe the reason you're here is to learn unconditional love. And so the way you'll learn it is through its opposite, which is conditional love or betrayal. And until you learn to accept betrayal as a concept, you'll continue to experience betrayal with increasing severity over and over and over again. And then the moment you finally learn to accept the concept of betrayal is the moment you finally learn the concept of unconditional love.
Yeah, well said. Well said. And I truly believe that's a theme in a lot of what I talk about and teach is if we don't do that inner work, involution, then we don't evolve. If we don't do that inner work and do that healing process, we can't really move into wholeness and unconditional love. You can't do a spiritual bypass.
So do you think that maybe this connection back to Orion, Osiris, and as I was just thinking, because you pointed out this notion that Sirius doesn't have the same path, right? Because it's our binary star. And that it's almost as if you've got a play of our lives in the sky.
Yes, exactly.
And we think that we're making good decisions and bad decisions and everything, and we're here to learn better judgment. But actually, the world doesn't need more judgment. It just needs the experience and will always come back to falling in love with itself because that's part of the cycle. And right now, Orion is high in the sky, right? Because it's going through his resurrection, as it were, and entering into higher conscious awareness. And as we do this, we're basically just going through all of our incarnation lifetimes in this story of Orion in the duat, and we take on the characteristics of the collective awareness of what Orion has also been going through.
Yes. And I do believe the story is completely playing out in the sky and guiding us through this process. And I do believe we have free will. So I don't believe that as we go through the different ages, we're destined to experience them in a particular way. We still have our free will and can. And I believe that part of this journey that we're in right now, and maybe part of this prominence of Orion and these, transits that are happening in relationship to Orion are trying to say, we have the capacity to wake up and stop going through that cycle in a way that we've been doing it, at least in the last 6,000 years, in an unconscious way. We can actually come into awakening to be in this journey from a path of higher consciousness, to enjoy the different expressions of these energies as we move through the cycle without being identified with them or controlled by them, so that we're actually coming more from our soul selves than by personality selves that just keep getting shaped by the experiences of our lives or of the ages. That's, I think, a deeper journey that we're meant to perhaps awaken to at this time.
I agree. I mean, that's such a beautiful story, too. It's like, again, it becomes a new representation, at least in our own awareness. It's never been new. But it is the process with which consciousness undertakes viewing and observing itself.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And it loves the story.
Orion is unique. No algorithms, no propaganda, and no exploitation. Just end-to-end quantum secure data. Messages, groups, and shared media behind a wall of next-generation encryption.
So it loves the story of creating the friction. There's a dramatic flair to the one source creator, I think, somehow, to put us through all of this. It's like, why go through all of this? It's like, well, because it wants to learn. And each time it creates another mirrored reflection of each one of us. It's able to observe itself through a different lens.
Yes, and expand that experience of its own creative expression.
It's so beyond genius when you actually start to recognize that, but it changes the context of everything. What is suffering then? Judgment is a source of suffering, but suffering becomes the source of enlightenment. And we start to realize that not why did something happen to me, but rather why did I choose it? I in my collective sense. And maybe even though we still do have our free will, maybe it's an illusion of free will, because even what we will choose has been contemplated by the one who is outside of the dimension of time. It's like the scene in the movie Matrix when the Oracle asks Neo to sit down, and he says, "No, I'll stand. I choose to stand." And then 10 seconds later, he decides to sit down. And she looks at him like quizzically, and he says, "I decided to sit down now." And he goes, but you knew I was going to decide to sit down, didn't you? And she's like, "I wouldn't be much of an oracle if I didn't."
I know that is such a deep philosophical existential question that I struggle with constantly.
So where do you think the world is going to go over these next few years? You mentioned 2032 and this time frame between now and then. What do you see for the world coming?
If we do assume we have free will, then my sense is this is...
I do believe we have free will, but I believe even that free will has been known by source creator who's not bound by time in the first place.
So predestined in its own way. But anyway, so my sense...
he doesn't tell anyone that he knows this. Or maybe she doesn't tell anyone that she knows it.
But for us mere humans who are living it at this level of reality right now, I see these next 7 years as a karmic choice point. And I believe that part of what we're seeing in the turbulence on the planet right now is two different possible timelines. One of this movement into higher consciousness and awakening and transformation. The other trying to cling to these paradigms of the past. And I think what we're actually seeing in the chaos on the planet are tied in with what you said a few minutes ago. We are seeing the most extreme shadow aspects of our experience as humanity. To see those shadow aspects, to heal them, to clear them, so that we can move into higher consciousness together. But I feel like it's a critical choice point, and by 2032, when we come to that powerful configuration with Orion and Saturn and Uranus, we will either be united in that movement into higher consciousness on the planet, or I believe at that point there will be a dimensional divide. And those who are moving into higher consciousness will become homoluminous ones, will change our whole, we won't be carbon-based structures anymore, and move into a new earth. And those who need for their own journeys to stay in this third dimensional reality will there will be most likely another cataclysmic reset.
Well, I'm wearing my T-shirt here which is based on the 24-strand DNA and the crystalline matrix of it. And I definitely believe that what you're saying is correct. Although it may actually, I think it's actually already started.
Yeah.
I feel as though it's actually already begun.
Yeah.
And that's where I really believe that, we're going to be looking differently at all of this, that it is already exactly that way. Well, Heather, I really want to thank you for taking the time with me today. It's been really quite a conversation, and I love your work. And now where can people find out more about your work and learn more about what you're doing?
My website, risingmoonhealingcenter.com. And I also have my own YouTube channel and give out a lot of information there.
Well, and you also have the most soothing voice I think I've ever heard. Definitely have like a very soothing voice.
It's funny, Robert, because I have certain people who say they listen to my YouTube videos when they can't fall asleep. And I think, oh, is that a good thing or a bad thing that they use my videos?
It's a very good thing. No, it's a very good thing because like somehow, yeah, it definitely has a soothing quality to it. It's quite remarkable. So thank you so much for taking the time with me today. Keep doing what you're doing. And I'll look forward to seeing you in Egypt. Hopefully we'll go there sometime together. And I'd love to show you all the rest of the stuff that is on the walls, not just in there, but also in the Queen's Chamber. The Queen's Chamber also has etchings all over the walls. And there's not a single place on the walls that isn't covered with a petroglyph.
It's just amazing. I really hope to see those more clearly the next trip.
Awesome. Well, one thing you could do, just as a side note, and this is true for everybody, is geometry. If you basically start drawing geometry, it helps your mind be able to dramatically increase your apophenia, right? Your ability to perceive pattern.
Activates the right brain.
Yes, it activates the right brain and the connective tissue at the corpus callosum, just as you said, that allows that connection point. So math is the left brain representation. Mathematics is the abstract form of music. Because everything in music is all musical, mathematical interval. And the center point of the brain is the seat where geometry is. So because geometry is just the music we experience with our eyes.
Beautiful, beautiful.
So if you start drawing geometry, it will start putting all this together. So you become like this super pattern recognizer. Because it's really expanding the neural network that's inside of the corpus callosum.
Beautiful. That's a great suggestion.
So such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much. Until next week on Think Tank, everyone have a wonderful week. All the best.
Thank you.